With the new Dragonflight expansion, Blizzard has implemented a new loot system called group loot. And with this change, there seems to be some negativity and confusion amongst the player base. In this video, I'm going to explain what the group loot system is and why it is basically a win-win for everyone. Before you understand the loot system, you have to understand how gear is ranked. Now, full disclaimer here, we do know that Blizzard ranks gear. We just don't know the exact process that they use for it. However, I feel as though my explanation will at least clear it up and make it understandable for everyone. When Blizzard creates a new piece of gear, they decide if that piece of gear is best for a tank, a melee DPS, caster DPS, a healer, etc. It is then assigned to its own gear ranking table. This ranking table is a hidden system. So let's say this gear ranking table is broken into 3 tiers: S tier, A tier, B tier. S tier is for the main specs that can benefit the most from that piece of gear. A tier is for those off specs that can also benefit from using that gear. And B tier is for all the other specs that it just doesn't really matter. In order to understand the group loot system, you have to understand how it relates to the Shadowlands personal loot system. Both are practically the same. When you join a dungeon or a raid, every player's class and spec gets logged. As you progress through the raid and defeat a boss, a few pieces of gear are randomly chosen to drop. The personal loot system then begins to work. It will examine the first piece of gear that drops. It will then pull up that gear's ranking table, and then it will compare that to the current raid setup. So for example, let's say the first piece is a tank favored piece. The system will grab the active tanks in that raid, and then it will roll to see which one of those wins that piece. The highest roller wins. It will then proceed to the next piece of gear and repeat this process. A couple key points here that the personal loot system does and doesn't do. It does everything behind the scenes, meaning that you don't see any of this actually happening. It does help with loot drama as you don't visually see losing a roll by like 1 point. It doesn't psychologically give you any reassurance. Since you can't see the actual rolls happening, sometimes it can feel as though you weren't even considered for that piece of gear. It also doesn't care what gear that player is currently using, meaning somebody can win the exact same piece of gear over and over and over again if RNG is in favor. And lastly, it doesn't care about any off specs. It only distributes gear to the main specs that are in that group. Now that we understand the personal loot system, let's talk about the group loot system. It works almost the exact same way. However, it's better. First of all, it's a visible system, which can have a positive psychological impact on your raiding experience. It feels really good seeing all of that loot pop up on your screen after you just downed a boss. Second, you can choose how you want to roll on every single piece of gear that drops. You can roll need, greed, or you can pass on it altogether. Once everyone selects their rolls, you visually see those numbers pop up and see who wins that piece of gear. Now I know, seeing that number can make someone salty. But that's fine, because this is the only downside to group loot. And if you feel like you deserved that piece of gear over someone else based off of performance, maybe you should join a guild that distributes gear accordingly. And the first comment that someone will make here is, well, I'm just going to need on everything that drops. Wrong. Group loot uses the gear ranking table to its fullest. You cannot roll need on gear that you cannot use, and that is not for your current raid spec. Here is how the gear ranking works. S tiers will always be able to roll need on gear that is best for their class and spec. A and B tiers will always be able to roll greed. However, A tiers, which are the off specs, will always win over B tier players. A perfect example of this is described on a blue post. A rep paladin cannot off spec loot a shield away from a main spec roll tank. However, anyone else rolling greed could never win it over them. Group loot also takes into consideration the current gear that you are wearing, meaning that if the exact same piece of gear drops, they are unable to roll need on it. They then fall to that B tier list. And lastly, players cannot win multiples of the same item type. So let's say that 2 shoulders drop, and both of those you can roll need on. If you win one set of those shoulders, you are unable to win the second set. You're removed from that roll. This group loot system is a complete win for casual and pug players. It also allows for other players to show kindness when it comes to gear being dropped. So let's say, for instance, you're farming heroics. Your other party members are better geared than you, and a piece of gear drops that is a substantial upgrade for you. The personal loot system didn't care and would still throw the gear to the specs that could use it and that won the roll. Now, if that person wanted to be nice, they could trade it to you, but that requires extra steps. Finding the gear, opening the trade menu, navigating to the character, and so on. Basically, just wasting time when everyone is trying to fly through and finish the dungeon. With group loot, that player can see the gear drop, know that it's a downgrade to what they currently have, and just greet it, meaning that they won't win it over top of somebody who actually needs it. Obviously, this isn't always going to be the case, but I do think there will be more positive experiences as opposed to negatives. You're just not gonna hear about the positive ones or remember them as much as the negative ones. So let me give you a full hypothetical example here. You have a party of 5, 1 Prot Paladin, 1 Ret Paladin, 1 Death Knight, 1 Fury Warrior, and a Priest. You defeat a boss and a shield drops. The ranking table is as follows. S tier is the Prot Paladin. A tier is the Ret Paladin and the Fury Warrior, and B tier is the Death Knight and the Priest. The only player that can roll need on this shield is the Prot Paladin, as he is the current active tank in the party. The Ret Paladin, the Fury Warrior, the Death Knight, and the Priest can only roll greed. Now, let's say that the Prot Paladin passes on the shield because he doesn't need nor want it. The Ret Paladin, the Warrior, the Death Knight, and the Priest all roll greed. The gear rank table knows that the Ret Paladin and the Warrior could potentially use the shield as an off-spec, so they are placed into the A tier, and that the Death Knight and the Priest are unable to use that shield, so they are placed into the B tier. The A tier ranks higher than the B tier. Therefore, the Ret Paladin and the Warrior will both roll to see who claims the shield. The group loot system will not allow the Death Knight nor the Priest to roll on that shield against the Paladin and the Warrior. In order for the Death Knight and the Priest to be able to roll on the shield, the Paladins and the Warrior would all have to pass, at which time a roll would take place between the Priest and the Death Knight. If this was the personal loot system, there would be no choices. The shield would drop, and the personal loot system would immediately locate the Prot Paladin and give them that shield. It would not care about the Ret Paladin nor the Warrior. The only way that the Ret Paladin or the Warrior could obtain that shield is if the Prot Paladin physically gives it to them. And yes, while the group loot system still relies on the kindness of other players, meaning that the Prot Paladin has to pass on the shield for the other players to have a shot, you have a much higher chance of that Prot Paladin pressing the pass button than you do him asking the Ret Paladin and the Warrior to roll. See which one is higher, locate the shield in his bags, and then initiate a trade window. So what are your thoughts on the group loot system? Let me know down in the comments below. If you watched this far, I know you like the video, so do me a favor and hit the thumbs up. I would appreciate it. And if you like WoW or other MMO content, check out my channel and subscribe. I'm also looking for a guild. Hit me up. My armory link is down below. I'll see you guys in Dragonflight.